This is you, a creative person who finds yourself watching this video because you may feel that creative urge, that need to draw. However, you've been having trouble focusing and giving clear direction to your drawing skills. The information available on the internet doesn't help much either. It's massive and heterogeneous, and perhaps it contributes more to your anxiety than to your motivation to draw. So here you are, watching a random YouTuber's video, maybe attracted by the title and thumbnail, and thinking with some skepticism that it's just clickbait meant to grab your attention. However, today we're going to see how you can learn to draw and greatly improve your skills in a reasonable amount of time. So let's get started. One of the main issues I've observed among those who, despite their love for drawing, do not see the results they desire is the lack of a method. There are so many stimuli from social media and so many great artists to compare oneself to that when they learn something, that knowledge conflicts with a new creator telling them it's no longer valid or that they shouldn't do it that way. This influx of prominent artists creates an anxious and self-destructive loop that ultimately ruins the fun factor that one had when they started drawing. This overwhelming wave of information dilutes the opportunity to have a solid, stable, and replicable method that one can fully enjoy. But you might say, a method? Isn't drawing supposed to be pure artistic expression? And you're right. The reality is that there isn't a single effective method for creating impactful art. In fact, I believe the right way to view drawing skill is as a goal. But the paths to reach that goal are numerous. However, despite being diverse and valid, all great artists have something in common. A defined workflow, as we mentioned, a method. I personally have been drawing since I was 5 years old. But it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I started to define my method. A tool that allows me to know exactly what to do at each moment and achieve predictable results that I can consider good and effective. I call this method the 4D decomposition system. Yeah, fancy name, huh? So, what is this 4D decomposition system all about? It's about how you perceive what you want to draw. Basically, it's understanding that any object, animal, person, character, or even scene and landscape is the sum of 4 elements that you will decompose to specialize in each of those parts. And what are these elements? It's quite simple. They are form, light and shadow, color, and what we will call X factor. Great, let's look at a practical example to understand this method. Here is an apple and a bitten apple. We could start drawing them directly, but if we take a moment in front of our digital tablet to observe them and apply the method, we might realize that we are more rigorous when executing that drawing. So let's give it a try. To start, the form. Thanks to this decomposition method, I can focus on each element in isolation, so I am much more concentrated on the shapes of the apples. Every crease, the shape of the stem, the shape of the dents in the bitten apple. Only with careful observation and by focusing on accurately copying the shapes I see, I can create a considerably good replica of what my eyes perceive in 2D. Thanks to this decomposition method, you can focus on each step in isolation, without thinking about anything else in the moment, focusing your efforts. Additionally, if you're doing digital drawing or digital art, your preferred software will allow you to work in layers, which perfectly aligns with this modus operandi. In conventional drawing, you'll need to pay attention to more inputs when creating, but even then, treating shape, light, and shadow, and color as their own entities is a good mindset for efficiently executing your art. Once we've refined that initial sketch a little bit more, we've got the first step of the method done. Both apples are drawn just with the 2D line art. It might be simple, but it helps us nail down their basic shapes and silhouettes. And now, we've got the perfect foundation to move on to step 2, adding light and shadow. A really useful tip for capturing the lights and shadows of your reference is to lower the saturation. This way, you can focus on just one thing at a time, which is the goal of this method, in this case focusing purely on the values. Values are what create that 3D effect in any 2D figure, but their importance goes way beyond that. Let's dive into it. This guy is Karl Kopinski. I talked more in depth about him in the first video on this channel, but to keep it short, the guy has an incredible artistic legacy. He shaped the universe of Warhammer and contributed to the world of magic. We could talk about so many aspects of Kopinski's art, but since we're focusing on values, let's discuss how he uses them to create such tangible spaces. Not only that, but how he uses light and shadow to tell stories within his artwork. And what better way to see that than with an example? Take a look at this image. Even when we lower the saturation, the artwork is still perfectly readable. you can get a sense of the 3D form of each subject and even where they're positioned in space. You know you've nailed the lights and shadows when, even without color, they're perfectly interpretable and clear to the viewer. That's exactly why mastering values is one of the most important skills to develop in both traditional and digital art. So with the lights and shadows from our reference copied, we've now completed step 2. And that brings us to step 3, color. I'll create a more detailed tutorial in the future explaining how I color my drawings step by step. But for now, let's stick with the idea that I start with color blocking for the main shapes. Then, I overlay the shadows and highlights layer we just finished to adjust the tones and contrast. Finally, I add subtle color details, trying to capture the fine variations in color from our reference. And finally, we come to the last step, for me one of the most important, the X Factor. And no, I'm not talking about that TV show. By X Factor, I mean that extra component, that magic, that creativity that every artist appreciates and should develop. Up until now, what we've covered are steps of a strictly technical method. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against the technical side of drawing and creating art. But I've seen countless times, both in courses and even in the academic field of fine arts, how the creative process gets reduced solely to this: a methodical, technical, even lifeless process. I've seen those still lifes and those studies 1,000 times to learn how to capture shapes, light, and shadows. And that's great and necessary, but creativity is a key that allows you to be more resourceful and versatile. It essentially lets you do more with the mental information you already have. And I have good news for you. Creativity is a perk you can level up, so don't forget to work on it too. For example, in this drawing I'm working on, I'm simply tapping into my mental library and letting my creativity flow freely. I don't forget the technical aspect, so I'm applying everything we've learned. But I add that extra layer of imagination to make the drawing more unique and memorable. And as a result, well, this. Quite cool, right? Of course, each of these steps involves much more. These steps are entire universes in themselves. And within them, there are many more specific skills to learn and develop. But breaking down anything you want to draw into these simpler structures can be a very good framework for properly structuring your learning process. So, how would I learn to draw in 100 days if I went back to the beginning? Well, let's imagine that the process we've discussed today is like the 4 legs of a table. If I make sure those legs are strong and well-grounded, I can build a solid table that will support new additional information. So, with 100 days, I would plan a focused learning approach to specialize in perfect form, light and shadow, color, and creativity in order to have a solid foundation as an artist. Thank you so much for being here. Subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.